My name is Catherine, and I'm 62 years old. I thought I had survived everything life could throw at me. I buried my husband after 37 years of marriage, watching cancer slowly steal the man who once made me laugh until my sides ached. I raised 2 sons through scraped knees, broken hearts, and teenage rebellion. I fought breast cancer and won, emerging scarred but grateful. I thought I had earned my peace, my dignity, my place in this family I had built with my own hands and heart. But I was wrong. It started with a cough, just a persistent, dry cough that seemed to settle in my chest after a particularly dusty cleaning day at my small apartment. Nothing unusual for a woman my age who had lived through decades of life's wear and tear. I didn't think much of it. Just another reminder that my body wasn't as young as it used to be. When my son Daniel called to invite me for dinner with his family, I was overjoyed. These invitations had become increasingly rare since his wife Jessica entered the picture 5 years ago. She was polite enough, but there was always a coolness in her eyes when she looked at me, as if I were an obligation rather than family. Still, I cherished any opportunity to see my grandchildren, 8-year-old Mia and 5-year-old Tommy, the lights of my life who still ran to hug me when I arrived. That evening, as we sat around their elegant dining table, so different from the simple wooden table where I had raised Daniel, I felt a coughing fit coming on. I tried to suppress it, covering my mouth with my napkin, but the cough escaped anyway, a harsh, rattling sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. "Mom, are you feeling okay?" Daniel asked, but there was something in his voice that wasn't concern. It was alarm, fear, as if I had just announced I was carrying the plague. "It's just a cough, honey," I said, trying to smile reassuringly at my grandchildren, who had stopped eating to stare at me with wide eyes. "Nothing serious." But Jessica was already standing, her face pale. "Kids, finish your dinner in the kitchen," she said firmly, ushering Mia and Tommy away from the table as if I were radioactive. I watched my grandchildren leave, confused and hurt. "Jessica, it's really just a cough. I've had it for a few days. Probably just dust from spring cleaning." "These days, Catherine, we can't be too careful," she said, not even looking at me directly. "Especially with the children." Daniel nodded, his face serious. "Mom, maybe you should get that checked out. Until then," he paused, glancing at his wife, "maybe it's better if you don't get too close to the kids." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had been dismissed, labeled as dangerous, treated like a threat to my own grandchildren. The hurt must have shown on my face because Daniel's expression softened slightly. "It's just temporary, Mom. Just until we know what it is." But I could see the fear in their eyes, the way they had both unconsciously moved away from me. In that moment, I wasn't their mother, their grandmother. I was something to be avoided, contained, kept at a safe distance. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And please comment which city you're watching from. That night, Daniel offered me their guest room, but I could feel the tension in the house. Every cough brought worried glances, hushed conversations in the hallway. I heard Jessica on the phone with her mother, talking in worried whispers about risks and exposure. I lay in their spare bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling more alone than I had since my husband's funeral. This was my son's house, my son who I had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, supported through college, celebrated at his wedding. Yet here I was, feeling like an unwelcome intruder in what should have been a safe haven. The cough seemed to worsen in the night, probably from the stress and hurt that had settled in my chest alongside the physical symptoms. Each cough felt like a betrayal of my own body, a confirmation of their worst fears about me. The next morning, I woke up hoping that the previous evening had been an overreaction, that daylight would bring back the warmth and normalcy I had always known in my relationship with Daniel. But when I came downstairs for breakfast, I found the kitchen empty except for a plate of toast and coffee left on the counter, far from where the family was eating in the dining room. "Good morning," I called out, trying to keep my voice cheerful despite the ache in my chest. "Morning, Mom," Daniel replied, but he didn't invite me to join them. Through the doorway, I could see Mia and Tommy eating their cereal, glancing toward the kitchen with curious eyes, before Jessica quickly redirected their attention back to their bowls. I ate my breakfast alone, listening to the sound of my family's conversation from the next room. They talked about school, about weekend plans, about everything except me. It was as if I had become invisible, a shadow haunting the edges of their lives. When I finished eating, I approached the dining room doorway. "Daniel, honey, I was thinking maybe we could take the kids to the park today. The weather's beautiful and—" "Mom, no." His response was immediate and firm. "We discussed this last night. Until you get that cough checked out, you need to keep your distance from the children." Jessica nodded approvingly, not even looking up from cutting Tommy's toast into perfect triangles. "It's really for everyone's safety, Catherine. I'm sure you understand." But I didn't understand. I couldn't understand how a simple cough had transformed me from beloved grandmother into a pariah overnight. I had been caring for children, my own and others, for decades. I had nursed them through fevers, held them through nightmares, celebrated their milestones with tears of joy. Now I was being treated like a disease carrier. "But I feel fine," I protested weakly. "It's really just a dry cough. I don't have a fever, no other symptoms." "That's exactly what makes it so dangerous," Jessica interrupted, finally meeting my eyes with a look that was equal parts fear and irritation. "You could be carrying something without even knowing it. These days, we have to be responsible parents." The implication stung, that by wanting to spend time with my grandchildren, I was being irresponsible, that my love for them was somehow selfish and dangerous. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Maybe you should call Dr. Peterson today, Mom. Get some tests done. Then we'll know for sure what we're dealing with." I nodded, even though getting a doctor's appointment on short notice wasn't as simple as he made it sound. My insurance required referrals, appointments had to be scheduled weeks in advance, and at my age, every medical professional seemed to assume that any complaint was simply the inevitable decline of an aging body. "Of course," I said quietly. "I'll call first thing." But even as I agreed, I could see that the damage was already done. The seed of fear had been planted, and it was growing faster than any explanation or medical test could contain. Throughout the day, the distance between us became more pronounced. When Mia ran toward me for a hug, Jessica quickly intercepted her. "Remember what Mommy told you, sweetheart. Grandma isn't feeling well right now." "But I want to hug Grandma," Mia protested, her small voice breaking my heart. "Soon, baby," I said, forcing a smile while dying inside. "As soon as Grandma feels better." But Mia looked confused, tilting her head as she studied my face. "You look okay to me, Grandma. You just have a cough, like when I had a cough, and Daddy still hugged me." Jessica's jaw tightened. "It's different, Mia. Now go play in your room." The comparison was devastating in its innocence. When the children had been sick, really sick with fevers and runny noses, they had been coddled, comforted, held close until they felt better. But my minor cough had made me untouchable. I spent the afternoon in the guest room, listening to the sounds of family life continuing without me. I heard laughter from the backyard, the splash of water from the kiddie pool, the excited shrieks of children at play. I wanted nothing more than to join them, to be part of their joy, but I knew I wouldn't be welcome. When Daniel brought my lunch to the room on a tray, I felt like an invalid, or worse, like a prisoner. "This is temporary, Mom," he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Just until we figure things out." "Figure what out?" I asked. "It's a cough, Daniel, not the plague." He flinched at the word plague, and I realized that's exactly what they feared, that I was carrying some unknown, dangerous disease that would harm their perfect family. "You don't understand," he said, running his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was anxious. "We have responsibilities now. The kids' health comes first." "And what about my health?" I asked quietly. "What about treating me like a human being instead of a threat?" For a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw the son I had raised, conflicted, guilty, torn between his wife's fears and his love for his mother. But the moment passed quickly. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he said, his voice returning to its careful, distant tone. "But we have to be practical about this." That evening, as I sat alone in the guest room while the family watched a movie together downstairs, I finally understood what was happening. This wasn't really about my cough. This was about control, about fear, about the way Jessica had slowly been creating distance between Daniel and me for years. The cough had just given her the perfect excuse to make that distance official. By the third day, I had become a ghost in my own son's house. I tried everything I could think of to prove I wasn't the threat they believed me to be. I offered to wear a mask, to stay in another room, to do anything that would let me remain part of their lives while they figured out this irrational fear. "I'll sleep in the garage if it makes you feel better," I pleaded with Daniel that morning. "Just don't make me go back to my apartment yet. Please, I miss the children so much." The look he gave me was a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if my desire to be near my grandchildren was somehow pathetic and inappropriate. "Mom, you're being dramatic," he said, not bothering to lower his voice even though Jessica was clearly listening from the kitchen. "It's just a few days, a week at most." But we both knew it had already been more than a few days, and nothing was getting better. If anything, their fear seemed to be growing stronger, fed by every cough that escaped my lips, every concerned news story they saw on television about mysterious illnesses spreading through communities. I had called Dr. Peterson's office repeatedly, but the earliest appointment I could get was 2 weeks away. When I explained this to Daniel and Jessica, they exchanged a look that said everything. They didn't believe me. They thought I was making excuses, prolonging their inconvenience, refusing to take responsibility for what they saw as my reckless disregard for their family's health. "There are urgent care centers," Jessica said coldly, not looking up from her phone where she was probably reading more horror stories about disease transmission. "Walk-in clinics? If you really wanted to get this resolved, you'd find a way." Her words cut deep because they implied I didn't want to resolve it, that I was somehow enjoying being treated like a leper in my own son's home. The truth was, I had tried the urgent care route. I had sat in a waiting room full of genuinely sick people for 4 hours, only to be told by a harried nurse practitioner that my cough sounded like seasonal allergies, and that I should drink more water and get some rest. But when I shared this information with my son and daughter-in-law, they dismissed it immediately. "One person's opinion," Jessica said, shaking her head. "These walk-in places don't really know what they're talking about. You need proper tests, blood work, x-rays." I felt trapped in an impossible situation. No medical professional seemed to think my cough warranted extensive testing, but my family wouldn't accept anything less than absolute certainty that I wasn't carrying some invisible threat. The worst part was watching my grandchildren adapt to my absence. On the 4th day, when I came downstairs for breakfast, little Tommy looked right through me as if I weren't there. When I said good morning to him, he turned to his mother. "Why does the sick lady talk to me?" he asked innocently, and my heart shattered into a million pieces. "She's not a sick lady, Tommy," Mia said, defending me with the fierce loyalty only an 8-year-old could muster. "She's Grandma Catherine," but Jessica quickly corrected her. "Grandma Catherine is sick right now, which is why we have to be careful. Remember what we talked about." I watched as my own identity was being erased in front of me. I wasn't Grandma Catherine anymore. I was the sick lady, a stranger to be feared and avoided. That afternoon, I overheard Jessica on the phone with her sister, discussing me as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person with feelings. "She's still here," Jessica was saying, her voice carrying through the thin walls. "I don't know what to do. Daniel feels guilty, but honestly, I can't have her around the kids. What if it's something serious? What if she gets them sick? Can't you just tell her to leave?" her sister asked, and I could hear the voice through the phone speaker. "It's complicated. Daniel doesn't want to hurt her feelings, but she's being so stubborn about this whole thing, like she doesn't care about putting our children at risk." I sank onto the guest room bed, feeling as if I'd been punched in the stomach. Stubborn, inconsiderate, a risk to innocent children. This was how my daughter-in-law saw me. Not as a woman who had loved and cared for her son long before Jessica ever existed. Not as a grandmother who would die before harming her grandchildren, but as a selfish old woman clinging to family connections that were no longer wanted. When Daniel came home from work that evening, I could see the exhaustion in his face. The stress of managing his wife's fears while dealing with his guilt over treating his mother like a pariah was clearly taking its toll. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, sitting down across from me in the living room while Jessica busied herself in the kitchen, clearly listening to every word. I think it might be best if you went back to your apartment for a while, he continued, not meeting my eyes. Just until you can get some definitive answers about this cough. And if the doctors continue to tell me it's nothing serious? I asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment. Then we'll deal with that when the time comes. But I could hear the doubt in his voice. See the way his wife's fears had infected his judgment. Even if every doctor in the world told him I was perfectly healthy, a part of him would always wonder, always worry that his mother might be the carrier of some invisible danger to his precious family. That night, as I packed my few belongings while the sound of family dinner drifted up from downstairs, a dinner I was not invited to join, I realized something that broke my heart beyond repair. I had become expendable to my own son. His wife's comfort was more important than my well-being, her fears more valid than my love, her opinion more trusted than my word. I had raised him to be a good husband and father, and now that very success was being used to push me out of his life. The values I had instilled in him, protecting his family, putting their needs first, were being turned against me like weapons. As I zipped up my small suitcase, I heard Mia's voice calling from downstairs. "Where's Grandma? I want to say goodnight to Grandma." "Grandma's not feeling well, sweetheart," came Jessica's reply. "Maybe another time. Another time. Always another time." But I was beginning to understand that another time might never come. I returned to my small apartment feeling more broken than I had since my husband's funeral. The silence was deafening after days of hearing family life continue without me. My one-bedroom home, which had felt cozy and sufficient before, now seemed like a prison cell where I was serving time for the crime of getting older, of developing a cough, of loving my family too much. The next few days blurred together in a haze of rejection and despair. I called Daniel every morning, hoping for some sign that the fear had passed, that reason had returned to my son's mind. But each conversation was shorter than the last, more distant, more final. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he would ask. But I could hear the hope in his voice that I would say I was better, that this nightmare could be over. "The same," I would answer honestly. Still just the cough. No fever, no other symptoms. And then would come the inevitable response. "Well, maybe give it a few more days." A few more days became a week. A week became 2. My cough, probably made worse by the stress and heartbreak, persisted stubbornly, as if my body was conspiring against any chance of reconciliation with my family. I finally got the appointment with Dr. Peterson, a man who had been treating me for 15 years and knew my medical history better than anyone. He listened to my chest, took my temperature, asked about my symptoms with the thoroughness of someone who actually cared about my well-being, rather than simply wanting to confirm his fears. "Catherine, this sounds like seasonal allergies, possibly aggravated by dust or environmental factors," he said, making notes in my chart. "Your lungs are clear, your vital signs are normal. I can prescribe an inhaler if you'd like, but honestly, this should resolve on its own within a few weeks." I nearly cried with relief. Finally, someone with actual medical training was telling me what I had known all along, that I wasn't dangerous, wasn't carrying some mysterious plague, wasn't a threat to anyone. I called Daniel immediately from the parking lot outside Dr. Peterson's office, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. "Daniel, honey, I have wonderful news," I said when he answered. "I saw Dr. Peterson today, and he says it's just seasonal allergies. Nothing contagious, nothing dangerous. Isn't that wonderful?" The silence on the other end stretched so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. "Mom," he finally said, and I could hear Jessica talking urgently in the background. "Dr. Peterson is, well, he's getting older, and you said yourself he didn't run any tests." "He didn't need to run tests," I protested. "He examined me thoroughly. He says my lungs are clear, that—" "But what if he's wrong?" Daniel interrupted, and I could hear his wife's influence in every word. "What if he missed something? These days, you can't be too careful." I sat in my car in that parking lot and felt the last ember of hope die in my chest. No amount of medical evidence would ever be enough. No doctor's reassurance would ever overcome the fear that had taken root in my son's mind, planted and nurtured by a daughter-in-law who had never wanted me in their lives to begin with. "So what are you saying, Daniel?" I asked quietly. Another long pause. "I'm saying maybe we should wait a little longer, just to be safe." Safe. The word had become a weapon used against me. a justification for cruelty disguised as caring. That evening, I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, staring at the empty chair across from me where my husband used to sit. The apartment felt hollow, echoing with memories of a time when I had been needed, valued, loved, without conditions. I looked at the photographs on my refrigerator. Pictures of Mia and Tommy from birthday parties and school plays. Images of a grandmother who had been welcome at family gatherings, who had been included in the joy and celebration of their growing up. Those photographs felt like artifacts from another life, evidence of a woman who had ceased to exist. The worst part was the growing realization that this wasn't really about my cough at all. This was about power, control, and the slow erosion of my place in my son's life that had been happening for years. Jessica had been patient, strategic in her campaign to minimize my influence and presence. She had waited for the perfect excuse, and my persistent cough had provided exactly the opportunity she needed. I thought about all the times I had bitten my tongue when she made subtle comments about my cooking, my clothes, my apartment. I had accepted being relegated to the children's table at family gatherings, being excluded from important decisions about the grandchildren's lives, being treated like an elderly relative to be tolerated rather than a mother to be respected. I had told myself it was normal, that all families went through adjustments when children married and started their own households. I had convinced myself that my son's love for me was unchanged, even as the evidence mounted that I was becoming increasingly irrelevant in his life. Now, sitting alone in my quiet apartment with only the ticking of the kitchen clock for company, I understood that my cough had simply provided the final push to complete my exile. 3 weeks after Dr. Peterson's clean bill of health, I tried one more time. I bought a gift for Tommy's 6th birthday, a toy truck he had been wanting for months. I wrapped it carefully, wrote a loving card, and drove to Daniel's house for the party I hadn't been invited to. I could see the cars in the driveway, hear the laughter and music from the backyard. These were the sounds of my grandson's birthday celebration happening without me. When I rang the doorbell, Daniel answered with a look of surprise and something that might have been panic. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "It's Tommy's birthday," I said simply, holding out the wrapped gift. "I wanted to give this to him." "I don't think that's a good idea," he said, not taking the gift from my hands. "You're still coughing." It was true. I was still coughing, though less frequently than before. The inhaler Dr. Peterson had prescribed was helping, but complete resolution was taking time, just as he had predicted. "I'll stay outside," I offered desperately. "I won't come in. I just want to see him for a minute, to wish him happy birthday." Daniel looked back toward the house, clearly torn between his mother's pain and his wife's expectations. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said finally. "Maybe next time." He closed the door gently but firmly, leaving me standing on the porch with my grandson's unopened birthday gift, listening to the sounds of a celebration I had been deemed unworthy to attend. I sat in my car for a long time, watching through the windows as my family celebrated without me. I could see Mia running around the backyard, could glimpse other grandparents playing with their grandchildren, could witness the kind of family joy I had been exiled from. As I drove away, leaving the unwrapped gift on their front porch, like an offering to gods who no longer accepted my worship, I realized something that cut deeper than all the medical dismissals and social rejections combined. I was grieving the loss of my family while they were still alive, mourning relationships that had died not from illness or accident, but from fear and manipulation and the slow poison of conditional love. But I still had something they had forgotten about, something they had overlooked in their careful campaign to remove me from their lives. I still had myself. Something shifted in me that night after Tommy's birthday party. As I sat in my apartment, staring at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized in my dark window, I realized I had been fighting the wrong battle. I had been trying to prove I wasn't sick when the real disease wasn't in my lungs. It was in the fear and manipulation that had infected my family. For the first time in weeks, I stopped calling Daniel. I stopped begging for medical appointments that would never satisfy their demands for certainty. I stopped apologizing for existing, for coughing, for loving my grandchildren too much. Instead, I began to watch. I began to listen. I began to remember who I was before I became the family's unwanted problem. I remembered the woman who had sat by her husband's hospital bed for 3 months, never leaving his side except to shower and change clothes. The woman who had advocated fiercely for his pain management when the doctors wanted to discharge him too early. I had been his voice when he couldn't speak for himself, his strength when the treatments left him weak and broken. I remembered the mother who had worked 2 jobs to pay for Daniel's college tuition when his father was laid off. I had cleaned office buildings at night and worked retail during the day, my hands raw from industrial cleaners and my feet aching from standing on concrete floors. All so my son could have the education and opportunities I had never had. I remembered the woman who had beaten breast cancer not with fear and self-pity, but with determination and grace. I had endured chemotherapy that made me so sick I couldn't keep water down, surgery that left me scarred and changed, radiation treatments that burned my skin like fire. But I had survived, had thrived, had rebuilt my life piece by piece. When had I forgotten that strength? When had I allowed their fear to make me small and apologetic? The answer came to me clearly. I had forgotten myself in the effort to keep peace in my family. I had diminished my own voice to avoid conflict with Jessica. I had accepted crumbs of affection from my son rather than demanding the respect I deserved. I had allowed their narrative about me to become my truth. But sitting alone in my apartment that night, I realized something powerful. Their fear of me was actually proof of my strength, not my weakness. They were afraid, because on some level, they knew they were wrong. They knew their treatment of me was cruel and unjustified. They knew that if they allowed me back into their lives, I would see through the careful fiction they had constructed to justify their cruelty. I stopped coughing so much that week. Whether it was the inhaler finally working, or the lifting of stress that had been making everything worse, I couldn't say. But for the first time in over a month, I could breathe easily again. More importantly, I stopped waiting for their permission to live my life. I called my old friend Margaret, whom I hadn't spoken to in months because I had been so consumed with trying to fix things with Daniel. Margaret had been my closest friend since our children were in elementary school together, and she listened without judgment as I told her everything that had happened. "Catherine," she said when I finished, her voice gentle but firm, "what you're describing isn't concern for health. It's emotional abuse." The words hit me like a revelation. Emotional abuse. I had spent so much time thinking of myself as a medical problem, a safety concern, a burden to be managed, that I hadn't recognized the systematic way my son and daughter-in-law had isolated me, dismissed my feelings, and made me question my own reality. "They've made you believe that wanting to see your grandchildren makes you selfish," Margaret continued. "That loving your family makes you dangerous. That's not normal, Catherine. That's not healthy. And it's not your fault." For the first time in weeks, I cried. Not the quiet tears of resignation I had been shedding, but deep, cleansing sobs that seemed to wash away the shame and guilt I had been carrying. Margaret invited me to her book club the next week, a group of women my age who met monthly to discuss literature and life. I had always declined before, thinking I was too busy with family obligations. But what family obligations did I have now? At that book club meeting, I met women who had survived divorces, deaths, illnesses, and family estrangements. I heard stories of strength and resilience that reminded me I wasn't alone in facing difficult circumstances. These women had maintained their dignity through trials that made my situation seem almost manageable by comparison. "The hardest lesson I learned," said Eleanor, a woman who had been estranged from her daughter for 5 years over a family dispute, "was that you can't control how other people treat you, but you can control how you respond to their treatment." I thought about those words for days afterward. I had been trying to control their fear, their acceptance, their love. I had been bending myself into smaller and smaller shapes, hoping to find a version of myself they could tolerate. But what if I stopped trying to be acceptable to people who had already decided I was unacceptable? What if I started living as if I deserved better? I began making changes, small ones at first. I cleaned my apartment thoroughly, not because anyone was coming to visit, but because I deserved to live in a beautiful space. I bought flowers for my kitchen table, bright yellow daisies that made me smile every morning. I started cooking real meals for myself instead of subsisting on crackers and tea. I also started documenting everything. I wrote down dates, conversations, medical appointments. I saved the voicemails from Daniel that grew increasingly cold and distant. I kept Dr. Peterson's written diagnosis stating clearly that I had no contagious illness. I wasn't planning anything specific. I was simply creating a record of the truth, a chronicle of how a loving grandmother had been systematically excluded from her family's life, based on unfounded fears and deliberate manipulation. But most importantly, I started remembering my worth, not as Daniel's mother or the children's grandmother, but as Catherine, a woman who had lived through hardship and emerged stronger, who had loved deeply and sacrificed willingly, who had earned the right to be treated with dignity and respect. It wasn't anger that filled me during those quiet evenings alone. It wasn't thoughts of revenge or punishment. It was something much more powerful than that. It was certainty. Certainty that I deserved better. Certainty that their treatment of me said more about them than it did about me. Certainty that I still had value and strength and love to offer, if not to them, then to others who would appreciate what I brought to their lives. For the first time in months, when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a sick old woman who was a burden to her family. I saw a survivor. I saw a woman who had weathered storms before and would weather this one too. I saw someone worth fighting for. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to call Daniel. I wasn't going to beg for reconciliation or plead for understanding. I was going to wait. And while I waited, I was going to build a life worth living, with or without their approval. But I had learned something important during those weeks of isolation and rejection, something I suspected they were about to discover as well. You can only push a strong woman so far before she stops trying to come back and starts moving forward instead. 3 months passed without a single phone call from Daniel. 3 months during which I discovered what it meant to live for myself, rather than existing at the mercy of other people's fears and manipulations. I had expected the silence to break me, but instead, it had given me something unexpected: peace. I filled my days with activities that brought me joy rather than waiting by the phone for crumbs of acknowledgement from my son. I joined Margaret's book club permanently and found myself looking forward to our discussions about literature and life. I started volunteering at the local literacy center, teaching adults to read, work that reminded me daily of my own value and capability. Most surprisingly, I began writing. Not anything grand or literary, just honest accounts of my days, my thoughts, my memories. Writing helped me process the pain of the past months, while also helping me remember the woman I had been before I allowed my family's dysfunction to define me. But I also kept meticulous records of my medical appointments, my attempts to reconcile with Daniel, and the systematic way Jessica had orchestrated my exclusion from their lives. Not because I was planning revenge, but because truth deserved to be documented, preserved, honored. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early December, my phone rang. It was Mia. My 8-year-old granddaughter had somehow gotten hold of a phone and called my number, which she had apparently memorized from the refrigerator magnet I had given them years earlier. "Grandma Catherine?" Her small voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Mia, sweetheart." My heart leaped with joy and terror simultaneously. "How are you, my darling?" "I'm okay," she said quietly. "But I miss you. Mommy says you're still sick, but you sound okay to me." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar ache of loving someone I wasn't allowed to see. "I miss you too, baby. More than you can imagine." "Grandma, are you really sick? Because Tommy asked why you didn't come to his birthday party and Mommy got really mad and said we weren't supposed to talk about you anymore." The innocence in her voice broke my heart. This child was being taught to fear and avoid the grandmother who had once been one of the most important people in her life, and she couldn't understand why. "Sweetheart, I had a little cough for a while, but I'm all better now," I said carefully. "The doctor says I'm perfectly healthy." "Then why can't you come see us?" she asked with the direct logic that only children possess. Before I could answer, I heard Jessica's voice in the background, sharp and angry. "Mia, what are you doing with that phone? Who are you talking to?" "It's Grandma Catherine," Mia said, and I could hear the pride in her voice, as if she had accomplished something wonderful. There was a brief struggle, muffled voices, and then Jessica's cold tone came through the phone. "Catherine, how dare you manipulate a child into calling you? This is completely inappropriate." "I didn't..." I started to explain, but she cut me off. We've made our position clear. Until you can provide documentation that you're not a health risk to our family, contact needs to be limited. I have documentation, I said quietly. I've had it for months. Dr. Peterson confirmed I have no contagious illness. I even got a second opinion from a pulmonologist. Both doctors say I'm perfectly healthy. The silence on the other end stretched so long I wondered if she had hung up. Those are just opinions, Jessica finally said. We need something more definitive. What would be definitive enough? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I don't know, she said, and for the first time I heard uncertainty in her voice. But we have to protect our children from their grandmother who loves them, from whatever you might be carrying that doctors haven't found yet. The conversation ended with Jessica hanging up, but something had shifted. For the first time, she had sounded defensive rather than righteously confident. For the first time, I heard doubt creeping into her justifications. The next day, I did something I had been considering for weeks. I made an appointment with a family counselor, not because I thought I needed therapy, but because I wanted professional perspective on whether my family's behavior was as abnormal as it seemed. Dr. Sarah Chen listened without judgment as I told my story, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing me to speak freely about months of systematic exclusion and emotional manipulation. Catherine, she said when I finished, what you're describing is a form of psychological abuse called medical gaslighting, combined with deliberate isolation tactics. Your family has used a minor health issue as justification for cutting you off from normal family relationships, and they've moved the goalposts repeatedly to make reconciliation impossible. She explained that healthy families facing health concerns would find ways to maintain connection while addressing safety issues. They would accept medical professional opinions. They would show compassion for the family member who was suffering, not additional punishment. The fact that no amount of medical evidence has been sufficient suggests this isn't really about health, Dr. Chen continued. This appears to be about control and power dynamics within your family system. She also pointed out something I hadn't fully recognized. By accepting my exclusion so completely, Daniel was modeling for his children that elderly family members could be discarded when they became inconvenient. He was teaching Mia and Tommy that love was conditional, that family loyalty had limits. Your grandchildren are learning that it's acceptable to abandon people they claim to love when those people don't meet certain standards, she observed. Is that the lesson you want them to internalize? That question haunted me for days afterward. I realized that by accepting my exile quietly, I had become complicit in teaching my grandchildren that their grandmother was disposable. I had shown them that a woman could be erased from family life based on fear and prejudice, and that such erasure was normal and acceptable. But I had also learned something else from Dr. Chen's observations. I had more power in this situation than I had been allowing myself to recognize. During my next book club meeting, I shared what the counselor had told me. The women in the group listened with the quiet attention of people who understood family dysfunction from personal experience. So what are you going to do? Asked Eleanor, the woman whose own daughter had estranged her years earlier. I'm going to stop accepting their version of reality, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. I'm going to stop pretending this is normal or acceptable. Good, said Margaret. It's about time. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with a pen and paper. For the first time in months, I was going to write to Daniel. But this wouldn't be a plea for understanding or an apology for existing. This would be something different entirely. I wrote about medical facts versus unfounded fears. I wrote about the difference between protecting children and teaching them to fear their own grandmother. I wrote about respect, dignity, and the values I had tried to instill in him during his childhood. But most importantly, I wrote about consequences. About how his choices were affecting not just me, but his children's understanding of family loyalty and love. About how his silence was teaching them lessons he might not intend them to learn. I didn't mail the letter immediately. Instead, I placed it in an envelope and left it on my kitchen counter, where I could see it every morning while I decided whether the time was right. But I could feel something building inside me, not anger or bitterness, but a quiet, steady determination that surprised me with its strength. I was finished being the family's guilty secret. The problem they hoped would simply disappear if ignored long enough. It was time for the truth to see daylight, and I was no longer afraid of what that truth might reveal about any of us. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for 2 weeks, gathering courage along with dust. Every morning I would look at it while drinking my coffee, running my fingers along the sealed envelope, wondering if I was ready to send the words that would change everything between Daniel and me forever. Then, on a cold January morning, my phone rang with news that made the decision for me. It was Margaret, her voice tight with concern. "Catherine, I just saw Jessica at the grocery store. She was telling everyone in the checkout line about her difficult mother-in-law who refuses to get proper medical care and keeps trying to expose their children to illness." My blood went cold. What exactly did she say? She said, "You've been diagnosed with a respiratory condition that could be dangerous to children, but that you're too stubborn and selfish to stay away from the grandkids." She made it sound like Daniel has to protect his family from his own irresponsible mother. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, the weight of this new betrayal settling in my chest like a stone. It was one thing to exclude me from their private family life. It was another thing entirely to spread lies about me in our small community, to poison my reputation among people who had known me for years. "There's more," Margaret continued reluctantly. "She's been saying this to other people too, at Tommy's school, at her book club, at the church they attend. She's creating a narrative that makes you look like a dangerous, selfish person who puts children at risk." The systematic nature of Jessica's campaign hit me like a physical blow. While I had been quietly rebuilding my life and accepting their silence, she had been actively destroying my reputation, ensuring that even if we eventually reconciled, the damage to my standing in the community would be permanent. This wasn't just family dysfunction anymore. This was character assassination. That afternoon, I mailed the letter, but I also did something else. I called my nephew James, my late sister's son, who worked as a lawyer in the city. I hadn't spoken to James in over a year, another relationship I had let slip while focusing all my energy on trying to maintain my connection with Daniel's family. "Aunt Catherine?" James's voice was warm and surprised. "What a wonderful surprise. How are you?" For the first time in months, I told someone in my family the complete truth about what had been happening. James listened in stunned silence as I described the medical exclusion, the emotional manipulation, and now the public character assassination. "Aunt Catherine," he said when I finished, his voice carefully controlled, "what you're describing could potentially constitute defamation if she's making false statements about your health status to people in the community." "I don't want to sue anyone," I said quickly. "I just want the truth to be known." "I understand," James replied, "but you should know that you have options. And more importantly, you should know that what they're doing to you isn't normal or acceptable. Uncle Robert would be furious if he knew how Daniel was treating his mother." My husband's name, spoken with such fierce loyalty, brought tears to my eyes. Robert would indeed be furious. He had raised Daniel to be better than this, to honor his mother and protect his family's dignity. James offered to drive down the following weekend to visit me, and for the first time in months, I looked forward to seeing family again. 2 days after I mailed the letter, Daniel called. "Mom, I got your letter." His voice was tight, angry. "I don't appreciate the accusations you're making." "Which accusations?" I asked calmly. "The ones about medical facts? Or the ones about teaching your children to fear their grandmother?" "You're being manipulative," he said, but there was something different in his tone. Uncertainty, guilt. "Daniel, I've been quiet for 6 months while your wife destroys my reputation in this community," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "I've accepted exclusion from family gatherings, missed birthdays, and watched my grandchildren forget they have a grandmother who loves them, but I will not accept lies being told about my health and character." "She's not lying," he started, but I cut him off. "She told people at the grocery store that I've been diagnosed with a dangerous respiratory condition. That's a lie, Daniel. I have documentation from 2 different doctors stating I have no contagious illness. Would you like me to share that documentation with the same people she's been talking to?" The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of months of deception and manipulation. "What do you want from me, Mom?" he finally asked, and for the first time, he sounded like my son again, rather than Jessica's husband. "I want the truth to be told," I said simply. I want your children to know their grandmother isn't dangerous or sick. I want your wife to stop spreading lies about me. And I want you to remember who you are, who raised you, and what values you learned in this family before you married into another one. It's not that simple, he said, but his voice was weak, defeated. It's exactly that simple, I replied. You choose truth or you choose lies. You choose family or you choose fear. You choose to be the man your father and I raised, or you choose to be the husband Jessica is trying to create. After he hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and waited. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I knew something was about to happen. You can't speak truth to lies without consequences, and I was prepared for whatever came next. What I wasn't prepared for was the knock on my door 3 days later. When I opened it, I found Mia standing on my doorstep, her hand held tightly in the grasp of a woman I didn't recognize, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair who looked to be about my age. "Mrs. Morrison?" the woman asked gently. "I'm Susan Walker, Mia's teacher. I think we need to talk." My granddaughter looked up at me with eyes that were wide and confused, but also hopeful. "Grandma Catherine, Miss Walker says you're not really sick. She says Mommy was wrong about you." I looked from my granddaughter to her teacher, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. "May we come in?" Susan Walker asked. "There are some things you need to know about what your granddaughter has been telling people at school." As I stepped aside to let them into my apartment, I realized that the truth I had been so carefully documenting was finally about to see daylight. But the person bringing it to light wasn't me. It was an 8-year-old girl who had never stopped believing in her grandmother's love, even when the adults around her had tried to teach her otherwise. The reckoning I had been building toward for months was finally here. And it was being delivered by the most powerful force in the world, a child's unwavering faith in the people who love her. Susan Walker sat in my living room with the practiced calm of an educator who had seen every form of family dysfunction, but her eyes held a sadness that told me she had rarely encountered anything quite like this. "Mia has been asking to call her grandmother for months," Susan began, watching as my granddaughter explored my apartment with the wonder of a child revisiting a half-remembered dream. When other children talk about their grandparents, she becomes very quiet and sad. Finally, last week, she asked if I thought her grandma was really dangerous, like her mommy said. I knelt down to Mia's eye level as she approached me with one of the photo albums I kept on my coffee table, pictures of her and Tommy from happier times. "Look, Grandma," she said, pointing to a picture of us baking cookies together last Christmas. "I remember this. You taught me how to make the dough not stick to my hands." "I remember too, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Susan continued her explanation. "I told Mia that grandmothers usually aren't dangerous to children they love. She asked if she could call you to check. And when I asked why she couldn't just ask her parents to call you, she said they don't talk about you anymore." The teacher's professional composure cracked slightly. "Catherine, this child has been carrying the weight of missing you, while being told that missing you means she doesn't care about her own safety. That's an impossible burden for an 8-year-old to bear." Susan had done what any responsible educator would do. She had investigated. She had called my doctor's office to verify my health status, spoken with other teachers who knew our family, even consulted with the school counselor about the emotional impact on Mia of losing her grandmother so suddenly and completely. "Everything I discovered confirmed what I suspected," Susan said. "You have no contagious illness. You pose no health threat to children. And your granddaughter is suffering emotionally from being separated from someone who clearly loves her very much." As we talked, Mia curled up next to me on the couch, her small body fitting perfectly against my side, as if no time had passed since our last embrace. She smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood, and holding her felt like coming back to life after months of barely existing. "I brought something for you, Grandma," Mia said, reaching into her backpack. She pulled out a drawing, a crayon picture of a woman with gray hair standing next to a little girl. Above their heads, she had written in careful second-grade handwriting, "I love my grandma, even if Mommy says no." The simple honesty of those words broke something open in my chest. But it wasn't the painful breaking I had experienced so many times over the past months. This was the breaking of a dam, releasing months of held-back love and hope. Susan had also brought something, A folder containing documentation of her conversations with school administrators, notes from Mia's counseling sessions, and medical verification of my health status. I took the liberty of compiling this information, she said, because I believe someone needs to advocate for this child's emotional well-being. And sometimes, Catherine, the most powerful advocate for a grandmother's rights is the grandchild herself. Within an hour of Susan and Mia's arrival, my phone began ringing. First it was Daniel, his voice tight with panic. "Mom, Mia's teacher called. She says Mia is at your apartment. You need to bring her home right now. She's perfectly safe with her grandmother," I said calmly. "We're having a lovely visit." "Mom, this is kidnapping. You can't just take a child from school." "I didn't take her anywhere," I interrupted. "Her teacher brought her here because she was concerned about a little girl who's been grieving the loss of her grandmother while being told that grief makes her selfish and dangerous." The next call was from Jessica, screaming accusations and threats through the phone, while Susan Walker listened with the professional detachment of someone documenting evidence. "You have no right to take our child," Jessica shouted. "I have the right to visit with my granddaughter when her teacher is concerned about her emotional well-being," I replied. "And you have the responsibility to explain to your daughter why you've been lying about her grandmother's health for the past 6 months." When Daniel and Jessica arrived at my apartment an hour later, they found Mia helping me make hot chocolate in the kitchen, while Susan Walker sat calmly in my living room with her folder of documentation spread across my coffee table. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything that had happened in our family before. For the first time in months, all the lies and fears and manipulations were laid bare in the presence of witnesses who couldn't be dismissed or silenced. "You're putting our children at risk," Jessica said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried for months. Susan Walker stood up, her teacher's authority filling my small living room. "Actually, Mrs. Morrison, I've reviewed all the medical documentation. Catherine poses no health risk to anyone. What's putting your children at risk is teaching them that love is conditional and that family members can be discarded based on unfounded fears." Daniel looked from his wife to his mother to his daughter, who was holding my hand with fierce determination. "Daddy," Mia said in her clear, honest voice, "why did you tell me Grandma was sick when she's not? Why did you tell me she didn't want to see me when she does?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, delivered with the devastating honesty that only children possess. For the first time in 6 months, Daniel looked directly into my eyes. What he saw there wasn't the broken, apologetic woman he had been dismissing. It was his mother, the woman who had raised him to be better than this, who had taught him to choose truth over comfort, courage over fear. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, and I could see the boy he had been, the man his father and I had raised him to become. But I also saw something else, the recognition that some damage can't be undone with simple apologies, that some choices carry consequences that extend far beyond the moment they're made. "I know you are," I said gently, "but sorry doesn't give me back 6 months of my granddaughter's childhood. Sorry doesn't repair the reputation your wife destroyed in our community. Sorry doesn't undo the lesson you taught your children about how family members should be treated when they become inconvenient." Jessica tried to interrupt, to reassert control over the narrative, but Susan Walker's presence had changed the dynamic completely. There was now an objective professional witness to their behavior, someone who could testify to what she had observed and documented. In the end, what saved our family wasn't dramatic confrontation or angry recriminations. It was the quiet insistence on truth over lies, documentation over hysteria, and the powerful voice of a child who had never stopped loving her grandmother. Mia spent that afternoon with me while her parents went home to have the conversation they should have had months earlier. When Daniel returned that evening, he came alone. "Mom," he said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table where we had shared so many conversations throughout his life, "I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, but I let fear make me weak. And I let someone else's anxiety become more important than our relationship." "I know," I said simply. "Jessica is getting help," he continued. "Professional help for the anxiety and control issues that made all of this happen. And we're starting family counseling so the kids can understand what happened and why it was wrong." I nodded. Healing was possible, but it would take time and work from everyone involved. "Can you forgive us?" he asked. I looked at my son, this man I had raised, who had lost his way but was trying to find it again, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, I said. And trust has to be rebuilt, not just assumed. But yes, Daniel. Love means giving people the chance to do better, even after they've done their worst. 6 months later, I moved into a small apartment closer to Daniel's house, but I kept my independence and my boundaries. Mia and Tommy visit me every week, and I attend their school events and birthday parties. Jessica and I maintain a polite but careful relationship. She's working on her issues, and I'm working on mine. Most importantly, I learned something during those dark months that I'll never forget. Sometimes the people who claim to love you will try to make you smaller to manage their own fears. But you always have the choice to refuse to shrink, to insist on your own dignity, to trust that your worth doesn't depend on other people's approval. I am still Catherine. I am still a survivor. I am still a woman who deserves respect and love without conditions. And I am still a grandmother who will never apologize for loving her grandchildren too much to let them learn that family love comes with expiration dates. In the end, I learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't fighting back. It's refusing to disappear, insisting on your truth, and trusting that love, real love, will find its way back to you. Some battles are won not with anger, but with quiet dignity and the unshakable knowledge that you are worth fighting for, even if you have to do the fighting yourself.